The wagon didn't even stop. Thomas Brennan just shoved the canvas flap aside, grabbed his daughter by the collar, and pitched her into the November dust like she was spoiled grain. The rest of the family kept their eyes forward as the wheels creaked past, leaving 16-year-old Sarah Brennan sitting in the middle of the Bozeman Trail with nothing but the clothes she wore and a worn blanket that had landed beside her. It was November 14th, 1873, in what would become Montana Territory, and the temperature was already dropping toward 15 degrees. Most folks who found themselves alone out here didn't last 3 days. Sarah watched the wagon shrink to a speck against the Absaroka Range, then disappear entirely. Her father had caught her teaching her younger sisters to read from his Bible, the one thing he'd forbidden after they left Pennsylvania. Said educated women brought nothing but trouble to a homestead. She'd known the consequences, done it anyway. Now she was paying for it in a place where payment usually meant death. The nearest settlement was Bozeman, 43 miles northeast. She had no food, no tools, no weapon. What she did have was something her father never noticed during those long wagon months. She'd been watching everything. How the wheelwright repaired axles. How the blacksmith forge-welded broken hardware. How one Swedish family built their first shelter using nothing but prairie sod and determination. Most importantly, she'd watched an old German stonemason named Klaus Hoffmann explain to anyone who'd listen about something called a Russian stove, a masonry heater that could warm a cabin for 18 hours on a single fire. Everyone had ignored him. Sarah hadn't. She stood up, brushed the dust from her skirt, and looked around. The Bozeman Trail ran through a valley here, with lodgepole pine climbing the slopes to the west, and a creek cutting through cottonwoods maybe 200 yards north. There was a reason the wagon trains followed this route: water, timber, and game. Sarah started walking toward the tree line. If she was going to die out here, it wouldn't be from giving up. Her mother had been a Shawnee woman from Ohio, though nobody talked about that in front of her father. What Sarah remembered most wasn't the stories or the language. Her mother died when she was 8, but the absolute practicality, the way her mother never wasted motion, never panicked, never assumed the world owed her comfort. That's what Sarah carried now, walking toward those cottonwoods with her jaw set and her mind already working through problems her father would have said no woman should think about. She reached the creek just as the sun touched the mountain peaks. The water ran clear and cold, probably spring-fed from higher up. Good. She knelt, drank until her stomach ached, then started looking for a campsite. Found it 30 yards downstream, a cut bank that formed a natural windbreak, with enough overhang to keep off any snow. She gathered deadfall until she had an armload, then remembered she had no way to start a fire. The November wind picked up, dropping the temperature fast. Sarah wrapped the blanket tight around her shoulders and started thinking. Her mother used to say survival was just a series of small problems solved in the right order. Problem 1, stay alive tonight. Problem 2, figure out tomorrow. The night nearly killed her. She wedged herself into the cut bank, piled deadfall branches against the opening to block wind, and pulled the blanket over her head. The temperature dropped to 9 degrees by her estimate, cold enough that her fingers went numb, even tucked under her arms, cold enough that she shook so hard her teeth rattled. She didn't sleep. She counted things instead. Counted to 1,000, then started over. Counted the number of times she'd helped her mother prepare meals, at least 4,000. Counted the wagon wheels she'd watched get repaired, 17. Counted the number of times her father had told her she'd never amount to anything. Stopped counting that one. When dawn finally came, gray and bitter, she crawled out of that cut bank knowing she'd learned something crucial. Shelter without heat was just dying slower. She spent that first day learning the landscape, found where the creek pooled deep enough to maybe hold fish, marked the pines that had died standing, dry fuel, located a game trail that showed fresh elk droppings, discovered an outcrop of sandstone that broke into flat pieces when she pried with a stick. By sunset, she still had no food and no fire, but she had a mental map of resources within a half-mile radius. That second night was colder than the first, dropping to 6 degrees. Sarah added more branches to her windbreak and thought about Klaus Hoffmann's Russian stove. He'd said the principle was simple: thermal mass. Build a masonry firebox with long, winding flue channels inside. The smoke and heat travel through all that stone before exiting, transferring warmth into the mass. Then the stone radiates that heat for hours after the fire dies. Conventional fireplaces lost 80% of their heat straight up the chimney. A proper masonry heater kept 70% in the room. She'd thought he was just a crazy old man at the time. Now she understood he'd been trying to save lives. Third morning, Sarah got lucky. Found a dead rabbit in the underbrush. Looked like a hawk had killed it, but got scared off before eating. She built a platform of green willow branches over the creek, laid the rabbit on it, and let the current wash it clean. Then she ate it raw, forcing herself to chew slow and thorough the way her mother taught her with jerky. It wasn't enough to stop the hunger, but it was enough to stop the shaking. With protein in her system, she could think clearer. The wagon trains were done for the season. Nobody had come through until April, maybe May. Bozeman was too far to reach without gear. That left one option: winter here, or die trying. She needed 4 things in order: fire, shelter, food supply, and heat. Not warmth. Heat. The kind that'd keep her alive when the real cold came, when temperatures dropped to 20 or 30 below and stayed there for weeks. Fire first. Sarah spent 2 days searching for flint, checking every rock outcrop within a mile of her camp. Found plenty of sandstone, some granite, even a vein of quartz, but no flint. She tried friction methods, the bow drill technique she'd seen demonstrated in Pennsylvania. Couldn't get it to work with frozen fingers and unfamiliar wood. She tried striking rocks together until her hands bled. Nothing. On the 5th day, she found salvation in the form of a broken bottle someone tossed from a wagon months or years ago. The curved glass had a magnifying effect. She spent 3 hours nursing a coal from a tinder bundle of shredded cottonwood bark and dry grass, blowing so gently her head went light. When the flame finally caught, she fed it like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. Because it was. Now she could think about shelter. The cut bank was temporary, exposed, wrong. She needed walls, a roof, and a chimney. A specific kind of chimney. Sarah spent a week scouting and found her spot a 1/4 mile upstream where the valley narrowed. A natural alcove cut into the hillside, maybe 12 feet deep and 15 feet wide, with solid earth on 3 sides and a southern exposure that'd catch winter sun. Perfect. She could build a front wall across the opening, install a door, and have an earth-sheltered cabin that'd stay warmer than any freestanding structure. But more than that, the hillside's thermal mass would work with her chimney design, not against it. This was November 26, 1873. She figured she had maybe 3 weeks before the serious snow started. Time to see if a 16-year-old girl could do something most grown men wouldn't attempt. The work started simple: clearing the alcove of rocks and debris, leveling the floor, digging a proper foundation trench across the 15-foot opening. Sarah used flat stones for tools, sharpening edges by rubbing them against harder rock. Her hands blistered, then bled, then calloused over. She worked 12 hours a day, stopping only when darkness made it impossible to see. Food was whatever she could scavenge. A grouse she managed to brain with a thrown rock, rose hips still clinging to bushes, an elk carcass left by wolves that gave her meat for 5 days before it spoiled. She lost weight she didn't have to lose, felt her hip bones getting prominent, but the work kept her warm and the purpose kept her sane. By December 3rd, she had a foundation trench filled with fitted stones and was ready to start the walls. That's when Wilhelm Kruger found her. He rode up on a mule one afternoon, an old German farmer who'd established a homestead 7 miles north along the creek. Late 50s, weathered face, eyes that had seen hard winters. He watched Sarah wrestle a 40-pound stone into position before he spoke. "You're that girl," he said. "The one got thrown from the Brennan wagon." Word traveled fast, even out here. Sarah straightened, wiped her hands on her skirt. "Yes, sir." Wilhelm studied her work, the cleared alcove, the foundation, the pile of stones she'd been gathering. "You planning to winter here, in this?" She met his eyes. "I'm planning to build here. Got about 2 weeks before the heavy snow. Figure that's enough." He didn't laugh, which surprised her. Instead, he dismounted, walked over to her foundation, and knelt to examine the stonework. "This is good fitting. Tight joints. Where'd you learn it?" Sarah hesitated. "Watched a mason in our wagon train. German fellow named Klaus Hoffmann." Wilhelm's eyebrows went up. Klaus? Crazy Klaus who wouldn't shut up about his Russian stove. Now Sarah allowed herself a small smile. That's the one. Except I don't think he was crazy. Wilhelm stood, brushed off his knees, and gave her a long look. Girl, I've been homesteading this valley for 3 years. Lost 2 families to the first winter. Froze to death in January when their firewood ran out and the cold hit 40 below. Lost another man last February when his cabin caught fire from an overheated stovepipe. You telling me you're going to build something better than what killed them, with no tools and no help in 2 weeks? Sarah pointed to the alcove. I'm building into the hillside, 3 walls already done by nature. Front wall only needs to be 4 feet thick to reach earth on either side. And I'm not building a regular chimney. I'm building what Klaus called a Kachelofen, masonry heater. Won't need much firewood once it's going, and it can't catch the cabin on fire because the heat stays in the stone. Wilhelm shook his head. You know how complicated those things are. I saw Klaus's drawings. It's not just stacking rocks. You need proper flue channels, draw calculation, thermal expansion joints. You need fire brick for the firebox, clay mortar that won't crack, a damper system. You need tools. Sarah had thought about this every night for a week. I got flat sandstone for walls, creek clay for mortar, and enough time to make mistakes small instead of big. The firebox is going to be regular stone. Won't last as long as fire brick, but it'll work for this winter. The flue channels I'll build simple, just serpentine instead of straight. And I don't need it perfect, Mr. Kruger. I just need it better than freezing to death. The old farmer was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed. I got an old axe head back at my place. No handle, but you could make one. Got a broken saw, too. Maybe 12 inches of blade left. And I suppose I could spare a few pounds of salt pork if you're going to starve otherwise. Sarah felt something crack in her chest, but kept her voice steady. I'd be obliged, sir. I'll pay you back come spring. Wilhelm waved that off. Just don't die, girl. I got enough ghosts on this creek without adding yours. He rode off toward his homestead, and Sarah stood there watching him go. Understanding what he'd really given her wasn't the tools. It was the possibility that maybe, just maybe, someone thought she could actually do this. The axe changed everything. With a handle carved from green ash and wedged tight, Sarah could fell trees instead of just gathering deadfall. She cut lodgepole pines, not the massive ones, but the straight ones about 6 inches through, limbed them, dragged them to her site, started building the front wall's frame. The design came together in her head as she worked. A 4-foot-thick wall made of 2 log frames with stones and earth packed between them. The inner frame would support the roof logs. The outer frame would protect the stone from weather. The mass in between would insulate and stabilize. It was crude engineering, but it was sound. By December 8th, she had the frame up and was starting to pack the cavity with fitted stones and clay mortar. The chimney was the tricky part. Sarah knew it had to be massive, maybe 4 feet wide and 6 feet deep, taking up a quarter of the cabin's interior. But that mass was the whole point. She built the firebox first, at floor level in the back corner, using the flattest stones she could find and mortaring them tight with creek clay mixed with sand. The opening was 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, big enough to take substantial wood but small enough to concentrate heat. Then came the channels. She built the first flue rising from the firebox's back, then turning horizontal to run along the back wall. At the corner, it turned again, running along the side wall back toward the front. This gave the smoke maybe 15 feet of travel through stone before it finally exited through a vertical chimney at the front corner. Every inch of that travel meant heat transferred into the masonry. Henry Blackwood showed up on December 11th. He was a former Union Army engineer who'd taken a land claim 5 miles west, building a proper log cabin with a conventional fireplace. 42 years old, confident, and used to being the expert in any room. He took one look at Sarah's construction and started cataloging problems. First off, that chimney's going to collapse under its own weight. You got no foundation under it, and the clay mortar won't hold when it heats and cools. Second, your firebox is built wrong. The stones will crack from thermal shock because you're using sandstone instead of fire brick. Third, even if it doesn't collapse or crack, you got no idea how to calculate draft. That fire's going to smoke you out or suffocate itself. And fourth, you're building into a hillside. Soon as spring thaw comes, You'll have water running through here like a river." Sarah kept working, fitting stones while he talked. "The chimney's got foundation. You're standing on it. I dug down 3 feet and built up from bedrock. The firebox stones might crack, but they'll last this winter, and I'll replace them next summer. The draft I calculated simple. Firebox opening is 2 square feet, chimney exit is 1 square foot, and I got 15 feet of vertical rise from firebox to cap. That's enough draw for the serpentine channels. And the hillside drainage I handled by digging a French drain along the back wall. It'll carry spring melt around the cabin, not through it." Henry walked around the construction, examining it closer. The foundation was solid. She wasn't lying about that. The stonework was crude, but surprisingly well fitted. The wall framing was actually clever, creating a thermal mass barrier that'd outperform his own log walls. He didn't want to admit it, but the girl had thought this through. "Even if all that works," he said, "you're talking about heating this space with 1 burn a day. You know how much wood that requires? You know how long it takes that mass to heat up? You'll freeze waiting for the stone to warm." Sarah set down the stone she was holding and looked at him. "Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate your concern truly, but I've been freezing for a month now. I know exactly what cold feels like. And I know this. Klaus Hoffman heated a whole house in Milwaukee on 2 fires a day, morning and evening. This cabin's maybe 90 square feet. That chimney's going to hold heat from a single fire for 18 to 20 hours. I fire it in the morning, let it burn hard for 3 hours while I'm working outside, then let the mass radiate. Temperature outside might be 0, but in here it'll stay 50 or 60 degrees all night. That's the difference between sleeping and dying." Henry wanted to argue, but something in her voice stopped him. This wasn't blind optimism. This was mathematics she'd worked out in her head during those long, shaking nights in the cut bank. She knew the thermal properties she needed, the heat retention she could expect, the temperature differential she could survive. He'd seen grown men attempt construction with less planning. "You got about a week before the serious weather hits," he said finally. "After that, you won't be able to work outside. Better have that roof on and the chimney finished." Sarah nodded. "I will." Henry rode off, and Sarah went back to building, moving a little faster now because she knew he was right about the timeline. The roof went up on December 14th. Not fancy, just straight lodgepole logs laid across the wall frames, then a layer of bark, then 8 inches of earth packed on top for insulation and waterproofing. The weight was enormous, but the earth walls on 3 sides and the thick front wall distributed it fine. Sarah left a gap at the front corner for the chimney pipe to exit, building up the stonework around it. The chimney itself was nearly done. The serpentine channels were complete, the masonry was drying, and she'd built the vertical exit stack using fitted stones mortared with her best clay mix. It wasn't beautiful, but it was functional. On December 15th, with the temperature at 12 degrees and snow starting to fall steady, she built her first fire. It smoked. Not terribly, but enough to sting her eyes and make her cough. The draft wasn't quite right. The channels were creating too much resistance. Sarah let the fire die, climbed up on the roof in the snow, and used rocks to add another 18 inches to the chimney height. Then she tried again. This time the smoke pulled clean, drawn up through the channels and out the stack with a sound like wind in a hollow tree. She fed the fire steadily for 3 hours, using dry lodgepole that burned hot and fast. The firebox stones radiated heat you could feel from 6 feet away. The channel stones warmed slowly, section by section, as the smoke transferred its heat into the mass. By noon, the entire chimney structure was warm to the touch. By sunset, it was radiating heat that brought the cabin's temperature to 48 degrees, while outside it was dropping toward 0. Sarah banked the coals, closed the firebox opening with a flat stone to trap the heat, and settled in for her first night in actual shelter. She'd stuffed the wall gaps with moss and grass, hung the blanket across the door opening, and built a sleeping platform from poles lashed together and covered with pine boughs. It wasn't comfort, but it was survival. Through the night, that chimney mass radiated steady warmth. She woke once around midnight, reached out to touch the stones, still warm, maybe 90 degrees. Woke again near dawn. Cooler now, but still warm enough that her breath didn't fog. The cabin temperature had held around 38 degrees all night with no fire. Outside, Wilhelm Kruger told her later, it'd dropped to 6 below zero. She'd survived the night warmer than she'd been in a month, using a fraction of the wood a conventional fireplace would have required. The catch-a-loafin worked. Word spread fast in that sparse valley. A 16-year-old girl had built an earth-sheltered cabin with some kind of experimental chimney, and she was still alive. Folks started stopping by, some curious, some skeptical, some hoping to learn something. Margaret Thorne rode over on December 19th, a widow running her late husband's claim with 2 young children. She was 34, practical, and tired of fighting a cabin that never stayed warm no matter how much wood she burned. "Show me how it works," she said, and Sarah walked her through the design. The serpentine channels that kept smoke in contact with stone. The thermal mass that absorbed heat slowly and released it slower. The closed damper system that trapped warmth after the fire died. Margaret touched the chimney stones, felt the steady heat, and said, "I'll be damned." Klaus wasn't crazy. We were just too stubborn to listen. But December brought more than visitors. On the 21st, the temperature dropped to 18 below zero and stayed there for 3 days. Sarah burned fires morning and evening, keeping the chimney mass hot enough to maintain cabin temperatures around 45 degrees. She had enough wood stacked inside to last 2 weeks without going out, and enough food, mostly dried elk meat and rose hips, to last maybe 10 days if she was careful. The cabin walls held firm against the cold, the earth insulation performing exactly as she'd calculated. On the 23rd, Wilhelm stopped by with actual supplies, a sack of cornmeal, some beans, and a handful of hardtack. "Merry Christmas," he said gruffly, then left before she could get emotional about it. Robert Mackenzie arrived on December 27th. He was a railroad surveyor who'd decided to homestead near the eventual rail line, and he came with the confidence of someone who'd built plenty of structures in his 47 years. He examined Sarah's cabin with a professional eye, checking the stonework, the roof, the chimney design. "It's clever," he admitted, "but you're missing something crucial. When we get a real blizzard, and we will, the wind's gonna come screaming down this valley and backdraft your chimney. That smoke'll get pushed down instead of up, and you'll suffocate in here. Need a wind cap on that stack." Sarah had worried about this but didn't have a solution. "How do I build one?" Robert thought about it. "Need something that blocks horizontal wind but lets vertical smoke out. Back in Illinois we used metal caps, but you don't have metal. Could do it with stone, though. Build a square collar around the chimney top with openings on all 4 sides, then cap it with a flat stone. Wind hits the collar instead of going straight down the pipe." They built it together over the next 2 days, Robert directing while Sarah did most of the physical work. The cap added another 30 inches to the chimney height and probably saved her life, because on January 2nd, 1874, the blizzard hit. It came from the northwest with winds that shook the cabin's walls and piled snow 3 feet deep in 4 hours. The temperature dropped to 22 below zero, then 26, then 31. Sarah had fired the chimney that morning, burning it hot for 4 hours while she could still see. Now she was sealed inside with the door opening, blocked by packed snow and wind howling like something alive. The chimney mass radiated steady heat. She could lean against it and feel warmth soaking through her clothes into her skin. The cabin held at 42 degrees while outside it was negative 31. That's a 73-degree differential maintained by nothing but stones holding heat from a fire that had died 6 hours ago. If you're finding value in this kind of traditional knowledge, the techniques that kept people alive before modern heating systems, consider subscribing. We're documenting these frontier methods because they represent practical wisdom that shouldn't be lost. Hit that subscribe button to help preserve these stories. The blizzard lasted 3 days. Sarah couldn't open the door. The snow was packed too tight, and the wind would have killed her anyway. She had water from melting snow in a pot near the chimney. She had food for maybe 5 more days if she rationed hard. She had warmth from the mass heater, firing it once every 20 hours and watching the cabin temperature fluctuate between 38 and 52 degrees. On the 3rd day, the wind finally stopped. The silence was almost shocking after 72 hours of constant roar. Sarah dug her way out through the door opening, pushing snow with a flat board, until she broke through into brilliant sunshine and air, so cold it burned her lungs. The valley was transformed, drifts 10 feet high in some places, the creek frozen solid, pine trees bent under snow weight, and her cabin, earth-sheltered and solid, had held against everything the mountains could throw at it. Wilhelm showed up the next day to check on her. Found her outside splitting wood, her face chapped red from cold but her eyes clear. "You made it," he said, and there was something like respect in his voice. "The Johnsons didn't. Found them yesterday, froze in their cabin. Ran out of wood on day 2. Sarah stopped splitting, felt that news settle heavy. "I'm sorry." Wilhelm nodded. They had a conventional fireplace, burned through 2 weeks of wood in 3 days trying to stay warm. "Your chimney there, it works like Klaus said it would?" Sarah patted the stone wall. "Used maybe a quarter of the wood they did and stayed warmer." He was right about all of it. Wilhelm looked at the cabin, the chimney, the girl who'd built them. "I'll be spreading word about this design. Folks need to know there's a better way." But better didn't mean easy, and January tested Sarah in ways the December cold hadn't. Her food ran low. She was down to 1 meal a day of cornmeal mush and whatever she could trap. Set snares along the creek and caught 3 rabbits in 2 weeks, which kept her from actual starvation, but didn't stop the constant hunger. The cold moderated slightly, staying between 0 and 10 below most days, but the work of keeping warm, gathering wood, maintaining the fire, keeping the chimney system clear, took hours every day. She developed a routine: wake at dawn, fire the chimney, work outside while it heated, come in when her fingers went numb, warm up against the mass, go back out. The cabin became an anchor point in a white wilderness, the only thing standing between her and death. On January 18th, Margaret Thorne brought her eldest son, 12-year-old Daniel, to see the cabin. The boy was bright-eyed and curious, asking questions about how the channels worked, why the stone stayed warm, whether you could build the same thing bigger. Sarah walked him through the principles: thermal mass, heat transfer, surface area for radiation. Margaret watched her son absorb the information and made a decision. "I'm rebuilding my place come spring, using this design. You'll help me?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I'll help anyone who wants to learn it." Margaret handed her a cloth sack. Inside were 4 potatoes, a chunk of salt pork, and half a loaf of bread. "Payment in advance," she said, and Sarah's eyes got hot because she understood this was more than food. It was recognition that she'd done something worth learning from. February brought a different crisis. A warm spell melted the surface snow. Then a cold snap froze everything into a sheet of ice. The game disappeared. Couldn't forage with everything locked under ice. Sarah's food ran out entirely on February 12th. She boiled pine bark for something to put in her stomach, chewed on leather scraps from her boots, felt her body starting to consume itself. On February 15th, she was too weak to gather wood and couldn't fire the chimney. The cabin temperature dropped to 26 degrees overnight. She wrapped herself in the blanket and shivered against the cooling stones, understanding that she'd survived winter's worst only to die during the thaw. That's when Henry Blackwood appeared with a haunch of elk meat and a sack of beans. He didn't say much, just hung the meat from her roof pole and set the beans on her sleeping platform. "You were right about the chimney," he said. "I'm adapting the design for my place. Figured you earned some payment for the engineering lesson." He left before Sarah could form words, which was good because she would have started crying. She cooked meat that night, eating slowly because her stomach had shrunk, and felt strength returning to muscles that had gone stringy and weak. The cabin warmed again with fires she had energy to build, and the world pulled back from that final edge. Spring announced itself on March 4th, with temperatures climbing above freezing and snow starting its long melt. Sarah ventured farther from the cabin, checking the French drain she'd built, working perfectly, channeling meltwater around her shelter just like planned. She found the first green shoots appearing in sheltered spots, discovered her snares catching rabbits again as the animals emerged from winter burrows. By mid-March, she was rebuilding her strength on fresh meat and wild onions. By late March, she was gathering materials for the expansion she'd been planning: a second room, a proper door, windows made from scraped hide that had let in light while keeping out cold. Robert Mackenzie came by on April 2nd with news. "Railroad's pushing through by fall, and they're gonna need workers. You interested in cooking for a crew? I vouched for you, told them you survived the winter alone in a cabin you built yourself. They figure anyone that tough can handle feeding 30 men. Sarah considered it. The money would buy tools, supplies, maybe seeds for a garden. I'll do it, long as I can keep my cabin. I'm not leaving here. Robert grinned. Nobody's asking you to. This is your claim now, legal or not. You held it through winter. That makes it yours by frontier law. The railroad crew arrived in September 1874, and Sarah cooked for them through November, saving every dollar. She taught the men about the Catchalofen design during evening hours, sketching in dirt with sticks and explaining thermal mass principles. 2 of them built their own versions at their claims. Margaret Thorne rebuilt her cabin with Sarah's help, installing a masonry heater that cut her wood needs by 60% and kept her children warm through the winter of 74-75. Wilhelm Kruger added a smaller version to his existing cabin, reporting that it transformed his life. By spring of 1875, there were 7 masonry heaters operating in that valley, and folks were coming from other settlements to learn the technique. Sarah was 17 now, lean and weathered, and no longer looking like the scared girl who'd been thrown from a wagon. She'd added 2 rooms to her cabin, built a proper door with hand-forged hinges, installed a root cellar that kept food fresh year-round. She ran a small-scale teaching operation, helping new settlers design and build their own masonry heaters for a fee. The money let her buy tools, a milk cow, chickens, and eventually a small forge where she taught herself basic blacksmithing. The cabin that had started as desperate survival had become the center of a community learning network. In the summer of 1876, a young surveyor named James McKenna stopped by to examine her construction. He was doing a study of frontier architecture for the territorial government, documenting what worked and what didn't in Montana's climate. He spent 3 days measuring, sketching, calculating heat retention, and interviewing Sarah about the design process. His report, still preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives, called her cabin a remarkable example of intuitive engineering combining European thermal mass principles with frontier necessity and indigenous earth-sheltering techniques. He noted that her chimney retained heat with 74% efficiency, compared to conventional fireplaces' 18%, and that her total winter fuel consumption was 1/5 the valley average, while maintaining superior interior temperatures. But the validation Sarah cared about most came from the people who'd survived because of what she'd learned and shared. By 1880, 43 families in the valley were using masonry heater designs based on her cabin. The winter death rate from cold-related causes dropped from 12% to less than 2% over those 6 years. Klaus Hoffmann's crazy ideas, filtered through a 16-year-old girl's determination and practical intelligence, had changed the mathematics of survival in Montana Territory. If you believe in preserving this kind of practical frontier knowledge, the real techniques that saved real lives, hit that like button. It helps us share these stories with more people who value traditional wisdom. Sarah married James McKenna in 1878, not because she needed rescuing, but because she'd found someone who respected what she'd built and who she'd become. They raised 4 children in that earth-sheltered cabin, later expanding it to 6 rooms while keeping the original masonry heater as the heart of the heating system. The oldest daughter, Clara McKenna Paulson, wrote in her 1943 memoir that she'd grown up believing all houses were built into hillsides with massive stone chimneys because that's all she'd known. It wasn't until she left Montana for college that she realized her mother's childhood desperation had created something most architects never achieved: a truly passive heating system that worked with nature instead of fighting it. The cabin stood until 1952, when Clara finally sold the property to the National Forest Service. They documented it thoroughly before dismantling it for safety reasons, noting that the original masonry heater, 79 years old at that point, was still structurally sound and functional. The stones Sarah had fitted with frozen hands as a 16-year-old girl had held their integrity through 79 Montana winters. Several stones from the chimney were preserved and are now in the Montana Historical Society Museum in Helena, labeled as Early Example of Catchalofen-Style Masonry Heater, built 1873 by Sarah Brennan McKenna, age 16. Modern masonry heater specialists who study her design note several things. First, she got the mass-to-room size ratio almost perfect. The chimney's thermal mass was ideally proportioned to heat her small space efficiently. Second, her serpentine flue channels, while crude, created exactly the right amount of surface area for heat exchange without creating too much draft resistance. Third, her integration of earth sheltering with masonry heating created a synergy that multiplied both techniques' effectiveness. They estimate her cabin stayed comfortable in -20-degree weather on approximately 11 pounds of wood per day. A comparable modern cabin using conventional heating would require 45 to 60 pounds. In terms of pure survival efficiency, she'd created a 4-to-1 advantage using nothing but observation, logic, and stones from a creek bed. There's a tendency to romanticize frontier survival, to imagine it was simpler or purer than modern life. Anyone who's actually read the mortality statistics knows better. The frontier killed people in huge numbers, from cold, disease, starvation, accidents, violence. What made the difference between death and survival often came down to tiny margins. One person's willingness to observe and learn, to try something unconventional, to trust their own judgment over received wisdom. Sarah Brennan survived being thrown from a wagon at 16 in Montana winter, not because she was superhuman, but because she paid attention. She watched Klaus Hoffmann explain thermal mass principles while other people dismissed him. She studied landscape drainage while other folks just picked flat spots to build. She calculated heat retention in her head while shivering in a cut bank, then had the courage to bet her life on those calculations. The technique she proved viable, masonry heating combined with earth sheltering, eventually influenced building codes in several Western states. Modern passive house design incorporates many of the same principles: thermal mass, earth integration, radiant heating, minimal heat loss. We've added insulation, precise engineering, and monitoring systems. But the core concept remains what Sarah figured out in 1873. You can work with natural systems to stay warm using a fraction of the energy conventional methods require. The frontier forced innovation because resources were scarce and mistakes were fatal. Sometimes the best ideas come from necessity meeting intelligence. In 1924, when Sarah McKenna was 67 years old, a reporter from the Billings Gazette interviewed her about her early years. He asked how it felt to have survived what most people would consider impossible odds. Her answer was characteristically practical. I didn't think about odds. I thought about problems and solutions. Needed shelter. Found a hillside. Needed heat. Remembered Klaus's stove. Needed to survive. So I did the work. The frontier didn't care about my feelings or my age or my gender. It just cared whether I could learn fast enough and work hard enough. Turns out I could. She lived until 1937, dying at 80 years old in the same valley where she'd almost frozen at 16, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and a community that existed partly because she'd taught them how to stay warm. The real legacy isn't the cabin or the chimney design, though those matter. The real legacy is the proof that marginalized people, whether by age, gender, or circumstance, can solve problems the experts missed if given the chance and the necessity. Sarah Brennan was thrown away by her father, literally discarded in wilderness winter. Within 3 months, she'd built something that changed frontier architecture in Montana territory. Not through luck, through observation, intelligence, courage, and work. Those 4 elements haven't changed. They still matter. There's still the difference between giving up and figuring it out. If you value these stories, the real accounts of how people survived and innovated on the American frontier, subscribe to this channel. We're preserving knowledge that textbooks ignored because it came from the wrong people or seemed too practical to be important. Hit that subscribe button. Help us keep these techniques and stories alive for the people who'll need them next. Because there's always a next time when received wisdom fails and someone has to figure out a better way using nothing but observation and determination. Sarah Brennan proved that's possible. Her chimney stayed warm through 20-below blizzards, and 79 years later, the stones still held. That's not sentiment, that's engineering.